You sold my soul to a dead man while I was behind bars, Julian, and now you expect me to toast to your wedding at my own table? The air inside the penthouse lounge of the Obsidian Towers was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and vintage champagne, a fragrance that felt suffocating to a man who had breathed only the metallic tang of prison air for 5 years. When the heavy oak doors groaned open, the melodic clinking of crystal stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it seemed to vibrate. Leo Moretti stood in the archway, the shadows of the hallway clinging to his broad shoulders. He wasn't wearing the designer silk of the elite guests. He wore the rugged dark coat of a man who had just walked out of a cage. His slate gray eyes scanned the room, cold and lethal, looking like polished stones from a riverbed. Across the room, bathed in a pool of soft golden light, stood Elena Vance. Her breath hitched, her hand flying to her throat where a 5-carat diamond necklace, Julian's latest gift, sparkled like a badge of ownership. She looked like a ghost, her face pale against her white silk gown. Beside her stood Julian Thorne, once Leo's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had promised to guard the Moretti Empire with his life. Now Julian's hand was draped possessively over Elena's waist. He didn't flinch. Instead, he tightened his grip, a smug, defiant smirk playing on his lips, as if to say, "The king is dead. Long live the usurper." The guests, the city's high society vipers and underworld lords, watched with bated breath. Leo stepped into the light, and the predatory grace of his movement made the room feel suddenly too small. And 5 years of concrete and iron had carved deep lines into his face, making him look older than his 35 years, but far more dangerous. He was a man who had been stripped of everything but his will. The suspicion of this betrayal had started as a slow drip in the darkness of his cell. First, it was the letters. For 2 years, Elena's words were his lifeline, passionate, raw, and hopeful. Then the ink changed. The letters became short, formal, and distant, until they stopped altogether. The second clue was the lawyers. His personal legal team stopped visiting, replaced by a stranger who informed him that all Moretti assets were being consolidated under Thorne Global for security purposes. Leo had never signed the authorization papers, and the third clue was the most painful. A grainy photograph smuggled into the prison, showing Elena and Julian leaving a gala together. Julian's hand wasn't on her arm as a protector, it was on her lower back, the gesture of a man who had already moved into another man's bedroom. The fourth clue was the total silence from his loyalists. One by one, the men who had sworn blood oaths to the Moretti name were erased, replaced by Thorne's mercenaries. And finally, the fifth clue, the news of the wedding of the century. Julian wasn't just taking the business. He was marrying the woman who was the heart of the Moretti family to legitimize his theft. "Leo, you shouldn't be here," Julian finally said, his voice oily and smooth, lacking the gravel-edged authority of the man standing before him. He stepped forward, leaving Elena standing alone like a discarded jewel. "The terms of your release were clear. You have no claim to this house, this business, or this woman. You are a shadow, Leo, and shadows belong in the dark." Leo didn't even look at Julian. His gaze was locked on Elena, searching for a trace of the girl who had promised to wait by the docks. He saw only a hollowed-out version of her, a woman living in a cage made of diamonds. "I didn't come for the money, Julian," Leo's voice was a low, vibrating growl that made the champagne in the guests' glasses tremble. And I didn't come for the towers. I came to see if the woman I spent 1,800 nights dreaming about was still alive, or if you had turned her into a ghost like the rest of my life. As Elena took a trembling step toward him, Julian's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a force that made her wince. The mask of the civilized businessman slipped, revealing the ruthless enemy beneath. Leo's eyes dropped to Julian's grip on Elena's wrist, and his pupils turned a lethal, burning silver. In that moment, the ledger of betrayal was complete. Julian hadn't just stolen a business. He had used Leo's own name and the threat of his safety to imprison Elena in a different kind of cell. "The wedding is canceled, Julian," Leo said, the finality in his tone echoing like a gavel. "Because by the time the sun rises, there won't be a Thorn empire left to marry into." Leo turned to leave, but as he reached the lobby of the penthouse, he froze. Standing by the elevators was a young boy, about 7 years old. He had a mop of dark hair and slate-gray eyes that were a mirror image of Leo's own. He was clutching a worn, stuffed wolf, looking at Leo with a mixture of confusion and a strange, innate recognition. Behind him stood an old housekeeper, her eyes wet with tears. "He doesn't know you, Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Julian told him his father was a coward who died in a fight. He's been calling Julian father for 3 years. Leo dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor. His heart, which he had hardened into a stone to survive prison, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The betrayal was no longer about a woman, a throne, or a business. It was about the soul of his son. Julian hadn't just taken his life. He had tried to rewrite his son's history. Leo reached out a scarred hand, and the boy, hesitant, but drawn by a bond he couldn't explain, placed his small hand into Leo's. The war for the Moretti name had officially begun. Julian Thorne had stolen his freedom and his queen, but Leo Moretti was back for his son. As he stood up, holding his son's hand, the shadows of the obsidian towers seemed to retreat. The Mafia Boss had returned, and he wouldn't stop until the man who tried to erase him was nothing but ash in the wind. The transition from the glitz of the obsidian towers to the cold, oil-scented shadows of a derelict warehouse on the city's edge was jarring. Leo Moretti sat at a scarred wooden table, the dim light of a single hanging bulb casting long, jagged shadows across the room. In the corner, on a makeshift cot, little Nico was finally asleep, clutching the stuffed wolf Leo had bought him minutes after leaving the penthouse. Every soft breath the boy took was a hammer blow to Leo's heart. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a father reclaiming a stolen legacy. The suspicion that had lived in Leo's mind like a parasite for 5 years was now a solid, undeniable reality. But to take down a man like Julian Thorne, who had spent half a decade weaving himself into the very fabric of the city's legal and social elite, Leo needed more than just his word. He needed a smoking gun that would incinerate the Thorne empire from the inside out. Leo reached into the lining of his old leather jacket and pulled out a small encrypted drive. It had been given to him by Marcus, the only loyalist who had managed to stay close to Julian without losing his soul. As the ancient laptop hummed to life, the first of the escalating clues began to flicker across the screen. The first clue was a series of wire transfers, and they weren't just random payments. They were dated 3 months before Leo's arrest. The money had flowed from Moretti accounts into a shell company controlled by the very prosecutor who had put Leo away. The signature on the digital authorization wasn't Leo's. It was a perfect forgery, authorized by Julian Thorne. Julian hadn't just stepped into the power vacuum. He had bought the law to create it. The second clue hit harder. It was a chain of internal emails between Julian and an anonymous contact within the narcotics division. The coordinates provided were the exact location of Leo's final shipment. But it was the final sentence of the last email that turned Leo's blood to ice. Don't aim for the tires. If he doesn't make it to the precinct, the merger happens sooner. Julian hadn't wanted Leo in prison. He had wanted him in a casket. Leo's fist hit the table, the wood groaning under the force of his fury. He looked over at Nico, the boy Julian had claimed as his own. The third clue surfaced in a folder labeled medical records. It was a recording of a phone call from 2 years ago. Elena's voice was frantic, sobbing as she begged Julian for help to pay for Nico's emergency surgery after a sudden bout of pneumonia. Julian's voice on the recording was a chilling contrast of fake empathy. The Moretti accounts are frozen, Elena. He had lied smoothly. Leo didn't leave a cent for you. He spent it all on his own lawyers. But I'm here. I'll pay for the doctors. I'll save the boy. But you have to stop writing to him. Every letter you send reminds the feds why they should keep his assets locked up. If you love Leo, you'll let him go. Julian had used Leo's own son's life as a bargaining chip to isolate Elena, making Leo look like a selfish coward who had abandoned his family. The fourth clue was the morality contract Julian had forced Elena to sign, a legal document that transferred all Moretti land rights to Julian upon the day of their wedding. He wasn't marrying her for love. He was marrying her to legally launder the last of Leo's legitimate holdings. The fifth and final clue, the one that would seal Julian's fate, was a hidden video file titled Project Phoenix. Leo clicked play. The video showed Julian in the penthouse library, pouring a drink for a man whose face was hidden in the shadows, but whose voice Leo recognized instantly. The head of the Valenti family, the Moretti's oldest rivals. Moretti is out of the way, Julian said in the video with a casual shrug. The girl is under control. Once the wedding is over and the land is mine, the Valentis can have the docks. I just want the throne. Leo was too sentimental. He cared about the neighborhood. I only care about the margin. This was the ultimate betrayal. Julian hadn't just betrayed a boss. He had sold his own people to the men who had killed Leo's father. Leo spent the next 48 hours moving like a ghost through the city. He visited the docks, meeting with the old guard stevedores who still carried Moretti coins in their pockets. He showed them the video. He visited the bookmakers and the street captains, men who had been squeezed dry by Julian's new, heavy taxes. To each of them, he offered the same thing: a return to the old ways, and on a piece of the Thorne Empire once it fell. The rising tide of loyalty was silent, but it was absolute. On the morning of the wedding, the Cathedral of St. Jude was draped in a deceptive peace. Julian stood at the altar, looking every bit the victor, surrounded by private security. He looked out at the wealthy guests, oblivious to the fact that the men serving their drinks and the drivers waiting in their cars were now answering to a different king. Elena walked down the aisle, her white dress looking like a shroud, Her eyes were fixed on the floor until the priest reached the final question. If anyone here has cause why these two should not be joined. Julian smirked, a man at the height of his vanity. But the smirk died as the heavy oak doors of the cathedral swung open. Leo walked down the center aisle, not with a gun, but with the truth. He pointed a remote at the massive screens Julian had installed to broadcast the ceremony. The Project Phoenix video began to play. The silence in the cathedral was deafening as Julian's own voice filled the sacred space, boasting about his betrayal. The elite guests, many of whom had lost loved ones to the Valentis, looked at Julian with a new, lethal clarity. "You're finished, Julian," Leo's voice rang out, projected by the cathedral's acoustics until it sounded like the voice of judgment itself. "You didn't just steal my life. You tried to sell our home to the people who want us dead. Look at the men in this room. Do you think they care about your bank accounts now?" Elena pulled her hand away from Julian as if he were a leper, stepping toward Leo. Julian, realizing his world was collapsing, reached into his jacket for a concealed pistol. But he was a businessman, and Leo was a soldier. Before Julian could even clear his holster, Leo was on him. The psychological dismantling of Julian Thorne was complete. He wasn't a king. He was a cornered rat, exposed in front of the very people he had tried to impress. But as the crowd began to swarm toward the altar, a low rhythmic beeping began to emanate from the vestry. Julian's eyes widened with a frantic, desperate light. "If I can't have the kingdom, Leo, no one can," Julian screamed. Leo's eyes snapped to the back of the room where Marcus was holding Nico. The betrayal had been exposed, but the true fight for survival was just beginning. The first explosion was not a roar, but a deep, structural groan that vibrated through the soles of Leo's boots. Then came the heat, and if the basement charges, meticulously placed by Julian as a scorched earth insurance policy, ripped through the foundation of St. Jude's Cathedral. Ancient stone pillars that had stood for a century began to buckle like dry kindling. Above, the magnificent stained glass windows, the pride of the city, shattered inward, raining down lethal multicolored shards upon the screaming elite. In the chaos, the divide between the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak, vanished. There was only the choking gray dust and the primal scramble for the exits. Julian Thorne, pinned against the altar by a fallen mahogany beam, was laughing. A high, shrill sound of a man who had finally lost his mind. "We all burn, Leo," he shrieked through a mask of blood and dust. "I'll see you in hell." But Leo Moretti didn't even look back. No, the vengeance that had sustained him through 5 years of isolation was suddenly a heavy, useless weight. His slate-gray eyes were locked on a single point in the swirling haze, a small, blue suit. Nico. Leo lunged through the falling debris, his lungs burning with the acrid scent of sulfur and pulverized mortar. He found Marcus huddled in a corner near the vestry, his massive frame hunched over the boy like a human shield. Elena was there too, her white bridal gown gray with ash, her hands clawing at the rubble to reach her son. "Get him out!" Leo roared over the deafening thunder of the collapsing roof. He swept Nico into his arms, feeling the boy's heart hammering against his chest. For a split second, their eyes met. The man from the stories and the boy who had been told he was a ghost. In that look, 5 years of lies withered away. Leo wasn't a shadow. He was a wall of iron standing between his son and the end of the world. The side vestry. The foundations are reinforced there, Marcus shouted, gesturing towards a narrow stone archway. They moved as a single unit, a desperate phalanx. Just as they breached the archway, a secondary blast rocked the nave, and the central dome finally gave way. 1,000 tons of stone crashed onto the altar, silencing Julian's laughter and bearing the throne Julian had tried so hard to keep. The vestry was a cramped, dark tomb, but the reinforced arches held. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the survivors. Leo sat on the cold floor, checking Nico for injuries with trembling hands. The boy was in shock, but alive. Elena collapsed next to them, her fingers interlaced with Leo's. He told me you hated us, Leo," she whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass. "He said you traded our lives for a shorter sentence. I only stayed because he promised Nico would have the best doctors. I became his prisoner to keep our son alive." Leo pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I never stopped writing, Elena. I never signed a single paper. Every night in that cell, I was walking back to you. Julian didn't just steal my life. He tried to steal my soul. But he failed, because you're still here, and he is gone." The redemption arc was no longer a plan. It was a reality forged in fire. But the nightmare wasn't quite over. From the other side of the collapsed vestry door, a metallic scraping sound emerged. Julian had survived, driven by a narcissism so deep it defied death. He had crawled through the wreckage, and a small secondary detonator still clutched in his hand. "You think you won?" Julian's voice drifted through the cracks, sounding like it came from the depths of a grave. "I've ruptured the gas mains, Leo. One spark, one more button. If I don't own the Moretti legacy, no one will." The scent of gas began to hiss into the small room. Leo looked at the ventilation shaft above, too small for him or Marcus, but large enough for a woman and a child. "Marcus, get them up there. Now," Leo commanded, his voice returning to its ironclad authority. "No," Elena screamed, grabbing his jacket. "I won't lose you again. Not to him." "Elena, listen to me," Leo said, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that defied the chaos. "I have to be the shadow one last time so you can be the light for him. Take Nico. Go to the docks. Find the boat called the Elena. The keys are in the secret compartment. Don't look back." He boosted Nico up to Marcus, who disappeared into the shaft, and then helped Elena. He kissed her one last time, a kiss that tasted of salt, ash, and a lifetime of unsaid things. As they vanished into the darkness of the ceiling, Leo turned toward the door. He didn't have a gun. He picked up a jagged piece of rebar, his eyes glowing with a lethal sacrificial light. The door burst open, and Julian stumbled in, wild-eyed and broken. He looked at the empty room, then at Leo, and let out a guttural scream. "Where is my son?" Julian demanded. "He was never yours," Leo said, stepping into the path of the hissing gas. "He has his mother's heart and his father's eyes. You're just the ghost who tried to haunt a house that was already full." Leo lunged forward, tackling Julian into the heart of the wreckage as the final supports of the cathedral began to scream. Outside, the morning sun was just beginning to break through the smoke, a silent witness to the end of an empire and the birth of a father. The dust of St. Jude's Cathedral did not settle for hours, but the world of Julian Thorne had collapsed in seconds. Beneath a slab of reinforced marble, a hand shifted. Julian Thorne lay pinned, his lungs laboring against the weight of the very altar he had tried to defile. But across from him, emerging from the haze like a phoenix from the pyre, was Leo Moretti. His suit was in tatters, and blood trickled from a cut above his eye, but his gaze was clear. He had used the last of his strength to tackle Julian away from the gas main, just as the primary structure failed, the impact throwing both men into a structural void where the air remained thin but breathable. Leo stood over the man who had stolen 5 years of his life. He didn't pull a trigger. To kill Julian now would be a mercy, an easy exit from the hell he had created. "You're going to live, Julian," Leo whispered, his voice a gravelly promise. "You're going to live to see every Thorn building seized. You're going to live to see your name scrubbed from every street sign in the city. You're going to rot in a cell where the walls have no ears and the floors have no gold. You'll be exactly what you tried to make me, a ghost." Leo turned and walked away into the gray morning light, leaving Julian to the sirens of the approaching police. The redemption of Leo Moretti was not found in a body count, but in the refusal to become the monster his enemy was. The scene shifted to the docks. The mist was rolling off the black water, cold and biting. Elena stood on the wooden pier, clutching Nico to her side. She had the keys to the Elena in her hand, the engine already humming, but she couldn't leave. Every fiber of her being was anchored to the shore, waiting for a man she'd been told was dead a dozen times over. Then, through the fog, a silhouette appeared. He walked with a limp, his head bowed, but his presence filled the harbor. Nico saw him first. The boy broke away from Elena, his small feet thumping against the damp wood of the pier. "Father!" he screamed. Leo caught the boy, and falling to his knees as Nico collided with him. He held him so tight that the boy's stuffed wolf was crushed between them. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated closure. The Mafia Boss had returned for vengeance, but he had stayed for the boy who called him father. Elena approached slowly, her ruined white dress fluttering in the sea breeze. She knelt beside them, and for the first time in 5 years, the Moretti family was whole. "It's over," Leo said, his forehead resting against hers. "The Thorn name is Ash. The docks are ours again, but not for the shipments, Elena, for the sun." As they boarded the boat, the news on the radio began to report the largest federal sweep in the city's history. Julian Thorne was being transported to the same maximum security wing where he had sent Leo. But there would be no loyalists waiting for him. And the Valenti family, exposed by the video Leo had played, was being dismantled. The city was purging itself. 10 years later, the sun was warm over the vineyards of a small estate nestled in the hills, far from the skyscrapers and the sirens. A tall, athletic 16-year-old boy was moving through the rows of grapes. He had a mop of dark hair and sharp, intelligent gray eyes. He carried a basket of fruit toward a large stone farmhouse, where a woman sat on the porch, a book in her lap. "Mom, the harvest is ready," Nico called out, his voice deep and confident. He was a young man of immense character, raised not in the shadows of crime, but in the light of honor. Leo stepped out of the house, wiping his hands on a towel. He was 50 now, his hair silvered at the temples, but he moved with the grace of a man at peace. He looked at Elena, then at Nico, and then at the small carved wooden wolf that sat on the porch railing, a relic of a past life that no longer held a power over them. The Shadow King was dead. Only the father remained. And so, the reign of the Shadow King ends not with a crown, but with a family. Leo Moretti's journey proves that while betrayal can steal your time, it can never steal your soul if you have something worth fighting for. If you found Leo's redemption as powerful as we did, make sure to hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these elite cinematic dramas to life. Subscribe to our channel to stay tuned for our next epic tale. We'll be diving into a world of professional betrayal next. A story of a corporate genius who is framed by his own mentor and returns to dismantle the empire he helped build. You won't want to miss it. What did you think of the ending? Did Julian deserve a worse fate? Or is rotting in a cell the ultimate justice? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one of your stories and theories. Thank you for being part of our community. Until the next story, keep the light burning.